So, French President Macron has decided to delay some of the gas taxes that he was going to implement that are said to be the reason for the protests and riots that we see occurring in France. So, for those of you who didn't know, there are protests, some would call them riots, occurring in France right now that are said to be the worst that have occurred in decades. The claim was the start of this was because of gas taxes that were being put in for reasons of environmentalism to fight climate change by the French president and his administration. And as a result, gas prices right now are currently over $7 a gallon in France, and average working people were saying this is too much. We can't afford to drive, we can't afford to get to work. The cost of all their products is increasing as a result of this. Now, there's a lot of things to say on this. The first of which is I'm not naive enough to think that everyone who's protesting is protesting for the same reason. There could be various reasons, but I do want to talk about the gas tax for a moment. One of the things I say about climate change and the proposed solutions to them is it's always striking to me that it seems that the poor and middle class people are always the ones that have to face the brunt of any change that we're told we need to have to affect the climate in a positive way. So, for example, let's say that gas prices are made so much more expensive in an effort to encourage renewables. That's the idea, right? That right now renewables aren't profitable because fossil fuels are so cheap. So if we raise the cost of fossil fuels through taxation, use that taxation to support renewables, inevitably we could have a system of different fuels. But if you raise those gas prices, wealthy people aren't really affected. If you're, for example, I know the United States better, so say you're in Silicon Valley or you're in Hollywood, one of these people that regularly fly around in jets like Al Gore or Leonardo DiCaprio telling us how bad we are for the environment while they have a carbon footprint in 1 year more than we'll have our entire lives. Do you really care that gas is $7 a gallon? Of course not. You're wealthy. You have millions of dollars. That price doesn't really affect you. But for someone who's making $35,000 a year, that could be crippling. That could mean that they can no longer afford to drive to work. It's not profitable for them to drive to work. Or that when they're going to get their groceries, the price of fossil fuels included in all sorts of commodities you use. For example, anything that's on a farm, fossil fuels went into producing that. Many products that's true of. And then any product that needs to be shipped, well, guess what? There were fossil fuel prices, energy prices included in that. So the average, average people or lower class, middle class people are the ones that are really affected. This is why, if you saw in some of my live videos when I was talking about climate change, I discussed, you talk to people that seem to mean well, and they're like, we need to get rid of fossil fuels. But you explain to them, look, there are a lot of areas in the world of developing countries, say somewhere like India, where the infrastructure of energy in India is not very good, and they rely on cheap fossil fuel. Because of cheap fossil fuels in the past 20, 30 years, life expectancy in India for poor people in India has shot through the roof because now they have access to reliable energy, but they can only afford these cheap fossil fuels. If we price them out of the game, then they'll go back to not being able to have reliable energy. So yes, we get to feel good. People get to feel good in their ivory towers saying, yes, for the benefit of the world in the future, this needs to happen. Meanwhile, these people go back to their life expectancy collapsing, going back to not being able to afford air conditioning or heat or other things that energy makes possible, which means that they're more likely to have a far more difficult life and possibly die because of that. And so it always seems to me that all these proposed solutions, it always gets passed the buck down to the lower of the middle class. So I do think that that is a big reason for why these protests were occurring. And the other thing I'll say is, Macron, I don't know, again, I admit to being woefully ignorant of the situation on the ground in France. I don't follow French politics as much as I follow American politics, for example. But presumably Macron pushed these gas tax, and I've seen some of the claims. It was about environmentalism. It was about affecting climate change. So I find that the kind of alarmist rhetoric that goes into pushing climate change legislation is kind of disturbing. We're always told it's going to be the end of the world. We're all going to die. We're reaching the point of no return. We have to do something. And even I have good friends of mine that I talk to are like, in 100 years, the world won't be recognizable if we don't do something right now. All scientists agree. Well, the problem is that with this alarmist mindset, that means that you're then encouraged to do drastic things like this gas tax, which means that life becomes unlivable for people in the lower and middle class. And now we see Macron delaying this. Well, wait a minute. If this was necessary to prevent the world from basically becoming uninhabitable in the next century or two, how could he justify rolling it back then? A couple protests and riots, that's enough to say, well, you know what, never mind, I don't want to save the world anymore. Of course not. It just goes to show that the alarmist rhetoric in the first place wasn't really what they believed. For example, California is a place where you hear a lot of people that live there talk about how serious climate change is and about how California is going to be under the ocean in 50 years. Why aren't they building levees then? it would seem to make sense. They know for a fact that this is going to occur. So then, okay, why aren't you taking steps to do what you can to subsist the damage? But for some reason they're not. So apparently the alarmist rhetoric of why these gas taxes were needed in France, not necessarily true, or they don't believe them now for some reason. And what this shows is that we need to have a serious conversation about climate change. What we have right now is you have a lot of people, and I'm biased, being someone that's Republican and right-wing, but it seems like anytime you have questions about anything, like, for example, the Paris Accord, you're just shut down as a science denier, and you hate the environment, and shut up, all the scientists agree, shut up, we don't need to talk to you. But it's not that simple. I do think that it's probably true that most scientists agree that climate's changing, but there's all sorts of debate of how much does man have to do with that, or things like sunspots more to do with it than man's use of fossil fuels and other things of that nature. Is it, how severe will the problem get? Are we talking a 5-degree climate change, or a 5-degree change in 100 years, a 0.5 degree change in 100 years? What does that change mean once we have a consistent basis of what that number would be? Does that mean that we're going to see millions of people wiped out, or you know what I mean, species wiped out? How severe will it get? How long will it take to get that severe? We need to have these conversations. We also need to have conversations on what possible solutions could we take, and how much would those solutions actually affect the problem? Because some models I've seen say things like the Paris Climate Accord, like possibly it could stymie like a 0.2 degree increase in temperature in the next 100 years. But if the problem really starts to occur at 1 degree increase, or whatever the number may be, is that 0.2 going to help? And we have to do a cost-benefit analysis. There is no solution. There's trade-offs. So what are we willing to give up to trade for whatever solution we could get? So we have to be honest about what the problem is, how big, when this problem will occur, what are our chances of being able to have a meaningful solvency of this problem, what costs we're willing to pay to solve the problem. And right now it just seems that we don't have that discussion. We just say, either you believe everything that all these people pushing the climate change agenda want, so we have to do things like the Paris Accord, and we have to do things like Macron's gas tax, and we have to do everything we can to eliminate fossil fuel usage, and the poor people be damned. Who cares if they can't exist? Who cares if you can't afford to buy groceries? Doesn't matter. That's fine, because it's all about saving the environment. And if you have concern about those poor people, or the cost, or whether or not this will actually solve, then you're a terrible person that doesn't believe in science, and you need to be shut up, because all scientists agree. So this is just proof that we need to have a real conversation on these matters, and I think that we're having woefully inadequate conversations, and as long as that occurs, I don't think you'll see any real potential solving of these issues, and I also think that attempts to solve will lead to public backlashes like we're seeing in France. Now, having said that, that's the climate change portion of this. I'm also not naive enough to think that everyone's protesting for the same reason. And although the gas tax may have been the start of this, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people protesting. So, and it's a big deal. I should have said from the outset that at least one person's died that I know of, and I hope that it could. And look, there's always bad actors on all sides, whether it be from law enforcement trying to contain the protest or the protesters themselves. I just hope that cooler heads prevail. The protests, I'm not saying shouldn't happen, but I hope that there's not a lot of violence. I hope that not a lot of people's property being destroyed. And I feel for anyone who might be going through that. Now, do I think that all 100,000 people were protesting for the exact same reason? Of course not. People are individuals. They have individual reasons to be upset with their government, and it sounds like, people are probably thinking, yeah, Rob's biased. Of course he's going to complain about climate change and supposed left-wing causes. Well, now, let me also say that a lot of what I'm reading, and again, I'm not on the ground in France, but there's at least a perception that Macron is like a president of the rich, that he's giving tax cuts to the extremely wealthy, something I advocate. Tax cuts for everyone, but he's giving tax cuts to wealthy, but increasing taxes on the poor, middle class. He's more interested in businessmen, wealthy businessmen, and the EU than he is the everyday working people. So some of that, like the tax cut for the rich, that would be a right-wing policy. Now, I don't know if that's, I haven't looked at the numbers to know if that's true, but it seems clear to me based on reading that that's at least the perception of people on the ground. So it's not just all, we perceive this climate change left-wing issue. It's also, we perceive tax cuts also to be, which would be a right-wing issue, to be a problem. So again, I'm not just trying to make it sound like it's just a left-wing government that's people are upset about. That's not what I'm doing. I'm sure there are all kinds of reasons. Now, having said that, I feel that the one common theme that would probably most unite these people, and I'm sure there's probably people that are just out there because they like being provocateurs and rioting or protesting, but I think the overarching theme is an idea that the government's not working for the average person anymore, or the working class. And I think you see this all over the world, the United States included. I focus on the United States because that's where I'm at and I happen to know the most about it. So I could see parallels to what's going on the ground in France, which is, if you're in France, it seems to me, as an outsider's point of view, it's like, well, geez, there's all this focus on migrants, and there's all this focus on the EU, and there's all this focus on wealthy people. But what about the average working person? Our gas prices are over $7 a gallon. Like, that's not attainable. You can't continue to exist like that. So where's the government working for them? And the government's constantly just like, be quiet, we have other things to do. I see the same thing in the United States. As a Republican, I'm kind of a libertarian-ish Republican. I support the idea of small government and free markets. I think that it's mocked and called trickle-down economics, but I think that the evidence is very good that actually what we see is when we have freer markets that even if there is an increase in economic disparity, it's the best system we've ever seen for lifting the actual bottom level up to a higher level. So the question becomes for me, are you more interested in solving economic disparity or having a better life for everyone? So to put it kind of in a visual sense, like if this is where the bottom's at right here, this is people, and there's not much economic disparity, and here's the top, would you rather have that, or would you rather have the bottom be raised, but the disparity, the people at the top are way above there? Now, granted, there's still issues once you get too ridiculous disparity. Even if the bottom's doing much better, there's still issues, and we could deal with those. I get it. But in a general rule of thumb, I feel that small government, free markets tend to lead to the best examples of that. Now, not to get off in too much of a tangent, but that's not the system we have right now, because that would also mean that there is no such thing as too big to fail, that people that are wealthy or like bankers or business owners that engage in criminal activity are routinely punished for it, and we don't see that. Instead, what we see is a system where gains by these wealthy are privatized. When they make money, they keep it. But when they lose money, it's socialized. We all have to bail them out. And that's not capitalism. That's not small government. But nonetheless, that was the idea of the Republican Party. You could argue whether or not they actually achieved that, but that's the idea. The idea of the Democrats used to be, well, okay, fine, but we need people speaking for the working class. And I understand I understand the importance of multiple parties, at least two, preferably more. But I understand the desperate need that we have for people that are looking out for the working class. Now, again, you could have questions whether or not the policies enacted by those people really do help the working class. That's fine. That's another debate. But you definitely need people whose primary focus is we are looking out for the working class. And I feel like the Democrats have abandoned that. Now they're more interested in identity politics. They're more interested in dividing people up based on gender, race. I'm with her, right? Everything's race, gender based. They're more focused on illegal immigrants. And what the Democrats have become is basically the party of the very rich and the poor, whereas the Republicans seem to be more of the middle class. But it seems that no one's really talking about issues that concern the working class. I think that's why Trump won. Let's be honest with ourselves. He basically has no business winning. He talks very brash, not presidential whatsoever. He was on a reality TV show. Used to be on WWE all the time, right? Why did he win? Well, he was the first person that came along that started talking about issues that American workers were concerned with. America first. Whether or not you believe his policies led to that, at least he was speaking to workers. And he was against things like the TPP and other NAFTA that working people, again, regardless if they're right or not, viewed that as being anti-American, as hurting American jobs. So this was an issue that people were like, yes, finally someone that's talking. Illegal immigration, to me, is the best example. The Republicans historically have not minded illegal immigration because they want cheap labor for their businesses. And the Democrats want cheap labor, or want illegal immigration because they like demographic changes. And they have this cultural Marxist idea of identity politics where they are the victims and therefore we must welcome them, and also they're hoping secretly that they could get votes in the future. But nonetheless, I think that whether you're on the left or the right, you could probably agree with me that it seems like our government on the whole has lost focus of average, everyday, working class people. The focus seems to be elsewhere. I think that France is a good example. This is what can happen. Eventually, people get fed up, and it's not just the United States and France. We'll see this all over the world. Europe has a unique challenge. It seems to me that a lot of these governments in the EU are more concerned with the EU and more concerned with things like migrants than they are with their own populations at home. And that would be very frustrating if you live there, especially if you're paying like $7 a gallon for gas. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but again, the overarching theme is I hope that no one more gets hurt and that things are limited, but it's interesting to me that Macron rolled back these gas taxes, delayed them, I guess, and it shows that once more, it turns out that many of these solutions to climate change always end up affecting the middle class and the poor, the lower class more than anyone else, and that there are other reasons we need governments to start actually looking out for the working class. So if you like my video, like and subscribe. Remember, I do recommend me to other people if you like. I do live stream every Friday at noon. So look forward to that, and have a good one.